Welcome to Dynasty Life. I'm Theo Greminger. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. Solo pod by myself today, back from Mobile, Alabama, Senior Bowl. This was awesome. I had a great time, got a lot done, unbelievable access to the players, had a great chance to see all of these players that are relevant for our fantasy football teams, focusing in on the offensive players. You want to go hear about defensive linemen? There's plenty of shows doing that right now. I'm here to talk to you about the skill position players that are going to be on your fantasy football rosters, your redraft rosters, your dynasty rosters. And the Senior Bowl every year is becoming more and more important when it comes to NFL draft evaluation. Last year, 43% of the total players drafted in the NFL draft played at the Senior Bowl in Mobile. That's 4 straight years where over 40% of the drafted players participated in the Senior Bowl. So I saw a little less than half of the players who were going to be drafted in the NFL draft in person. Pretty awesome experience to be able to do that. And Senior Bowl is one where you're not going to see guys like Ted McMillan. You're not going to see Ashton Genty. You're not going to see guys that have that guaranteed draft capital early on. This is a prove-it place. For some players, it's I'm proving it to get in the first round. For other players is I'm showing them a day 2 selection. And for some players, it's I'm an NFL player. I'm a Sunday player. I'm going to do it against other Sunday players. So the Senior Bowl means a lot to the players participating, and it certainly means a lot to us in our evaluation process. And anybody sort of brushing aside the Senior Bowl in terms of dynasty, in terms of redraft, in terms of whatever, is a little bit foolish. We go back to 2024, last year. Bo Nix, Michael Penix Jr. show up to Mobile. They're not even listed as like the top quarterback. That was Spencer Rattler. Those two guys end up being first-round picks. So it's like the start of their journey in terms of solidifying everything. Goes college football regular season, people like the tape. NFL teams get to be around them at the Senior Bowl, like the way they prepare, like the way they looked in drills, draft them in the first round. Ladd McConkey, stud, already a wide receiver 1 for us in Dynasty. He was sort of the hype guy last year. It was Ladd McConkey and Roman Wilson just dominating the Senior Bowl practices all over X, all over social media, just bald. And Ladd McConkey now looks like a staple wide receiver 1 for years to come. Absolute beast. Xavier Legette, Ricky Pearsall, both go to Mobile, both get inside the first round. Marshawn Lloyd, Ben Sinnott, 2 guys that didn't do it this year, but did rise up in terms of dynasty rookie drafts and their positional rankings. And we're not closing the book on Marshawn Lloyd or Ben Sinnott in 2025 and beyond. We like the profile. We're going to stick with those guys on our roster. 2023 was even crazier. Puka Nacua, Senior Bowl. Tank Dell, Senior Bowl. Rashee Rice, Senior Bowl. Jaden Reed, Senior Bowl. Puka ends up being this unbelievable player, but Rice and Reed, along with Cedric Tillman, end up being day 2 selections at the wide receiver spot. Jonathan Mingo also was there. He's not really doing anything, but he was still a high draft capital guy participating in the Senior Bowl. Tyjae Spears, Senior Bowl. So the Senior Bowl matters. A lot of these guys for dynasty players are going to be round 2 selections, round 3 selections. Some of them round 1 selections in your dynasty rookie draft. So there's guys just moving up boards, ready to make an impact. And I saw all of them. So this was really, really good stuff. No days off for me. Like yourself, I know that the NFL draft is 83 days away. So we're grinding here, getting ready, going to dominate our dynasty rookie drafts, going to dominate our early redraft best balls, and going to get overly prepared for the NFL draft. We've still got a lot of huge events coming up, seismic events. You got the NFL Draft Combine. You've got pro days. You've got all sorts of trades going in the back where guys are going to target certain players. Values are going to shift, but at least we have a baseline for a number of guys we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a ton of players from the Senior Bowl. We're going to talk about my winners. We're going to talk about some notable performances, and we're going to go through several of these guys. We're looking at guys who have now risen up rookie rankings for 2025, and a few guys that not necessarily talk of the Senior Bowl, but we're going to talk about what we saw on the field. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to review my Senior Bowl winners and also guys that I think did enough there that are maybe a little bit under the radar.
Now, I know many of you are looking for a secret weapon for your Dynasty League, and I have it. It's called the Dynasty Dominator app. You go to the App Store, go to Google Play. It's right there. It's $5 to download, and then every year it's $5 to load the next incoming class of rookies. You can add Superflex, add tight end premium. It's incredible because it allows you to look up players. It allows you to vote on whether a player is a buy, hold, or sell, and then see the market sentiment on that player. And you can compare their lifetime value rating from Player Profiler to their Dynasty ADP at the FFPC, all in the price lookup tool. And beyond that, we have a trade analyzer, so you'll never lose another Dynasty trade again. And in our settings, you can set this is a win now team, this is a rebuilding team, and then we let you compare players. Look at their metrics side by side, prospect metrics, NFL metrics. It's all there. It's $5 in the App Store. There's some add-ons for Superflex and to buy the upcoming rookie class. Every year, you're going to spend $5 on this thing, and it's going to be well worth it.
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Greminger. We're talking about the Senior Bowl. We're talking about rookie risers, guys who gained some value over a few-day period. And I'm dropping this before the actual game because the game doesn't really matter. The game is fun, but it's all about the practice. So just how this breaks down, there's a 2-hour practice session for each team each day. It gets broken down into all sorts of things you'd expect to see on a football practice. But for our skill position players, you see the passing drills for the quarterbacks. You see the 1v1 drills where they match up a running back with a safety or a linebacker, wide receivers versus cornerbacks, and so on. You also get to see 7-on-7 drills, get to see 11 versus 11. There was a lot of that. And there was also some special teams. They covered all their bases, but we got to see a lot of these players. Then you got to go down on the field and speak to some of these players. I got some very valuable information just getting a chance to talk to some of these guys. And you got to love it. Players who have put in so much work now are right on the cusp of being drafted. A lot of these guys have really inspirational journeys and really put in the work, as you can imagine, to get to the top of their field, really in the world. It's unbelievable for some of these guys, some really high-quality people when you speak to them also on the field to get to this sort of level. And that matters more and more in an NFL locker room. If you're a guy who's going in the top 5, top 10, NFL teams can overlook some things. But if you're a player that's going to be a round 3, round 4, round 5 type guy, character matters more and more and more. And you saw it with some of these guys down the field competing and the way that they presented themselves and carried themselves. So we're rooting for a lot of these guys too. Certainly there's guys that I walked in that I was impressed with as prospects. Some guys gain value, some guys lose value. And let's just talk about it. So this is a draft where my mock draft is up at playerprofiler.com. You can read that. I did volume 1. We dropped mock draft 2.0 for the NFL draft. And my last mock draft, I had 2 quarterbacks, Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, both being selected inside the top 10 picks. And that was it. 2 quarterbacks. So a lot of pressure on Jalen Milroe and Jaxson Dart this week at the Senior Bowl, the 2 most high-profile quarterbacks. And this was sort of a little bit of a mixed bag. We'll start out with Jalen Milroe. So Jalen Milroe's Alabama quarterback, this is a very smart player. And just in terms of what he's done off the field, the NFL teams are going to like the character, the makeup with Milroe. Beat Georgia this year. He's won some huge games at Alabama, played at one of the most high-profile programs in the country, and had some very bright moments. Also had some really bad moments, too. It was sort of a mixed bag this year, where after the Georgia win, Jalen Milroe looked like a guy that would be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. Then more and more games, some struggles, not what you really wanted to see. Positives. Jalen Milroe hit 22.5 miles per hour in a college football game on a long run. So 22.5 miles an hour, it's not a perfect science, but guys that hit 22 miles per hour can usually run about a 4.4. Doesn't mean he's going to do it, but let's say that he runs a step slow at the combine. He's still a 4.5 guy. So Jalen Milroe, 220 pounds, runs somewhere in the 4.4, 4.5 range. So the rushing ability is going to be there. Now, day one wasn't the best day for him at the Senior Bowl. And some of the quarterbacks, it's like they take a little while to get going. As you can understand, you're passing to new teammates, and they're not really teammates. It's sort of a short period of time teammates. And the timing, all sorts of stuff. They're maybe asking you to do things differently, footwork-wise. So benefit of the doubt. Milroe started out day two not so great, but then ended up finishing day two really, really well. He threw a pick in the early 11-on-11s, bad one. Then he recovered and had a couple of really nice throws. He's got throw velocity. So for me with Milroe, I don't have him in the first round, but I do think he'll be a second-round pick in the NFL draft, and there's a chance he goes in the first round. All it takes is one team. So the scarcity of the position and the fact that there's such a drop-off from QB4 down to QB5 this year, some team might fall in love with Milroe. You hear the rumors about the Pittsburgh Steelers. There's probably other teams who are not even putting it out there that have some interest in that sort of mobility. So we'll see what happens. But for me, the big winner at the quarterback position was Jaxson Dart. So Jaxson Dart is just enough that I think someone's going to push him inside the top 15 picks. This is a guy who was solid at Ole Miss. By all means, this was a quarterback that had success throwing the football. This is a guy who had 29 touchdown passes this year. He threw for over 4,000 yards. A lot of tools there to succeed as a passer. And unlike some Ole Miss quarterbacks who sort of let us down, like Matt Corral, those kind of guys, I think Jaxson Dart, there's enough hype there that I think he's going to go inside the first round. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he's going to be an end of the first round guy? Maybe. But at the end of the day, we saw what happened last year with Michael Penix and Bo Nix. These are guys that were projected to go at the end of the first round. Like the over-under in Vegas for Bo Nix and Michael Penix was like pick 28. But the NFL, it's go get your guy season at a scarce position like quarterback. So Jaxson Dart might have done enough to get inside the top 20. And once you're inside the top 20, then you could be a top 10 pick. So if he gets top 10 draft capital, you're talking about a guy that you have to take in your superflex rookie drafts towards the top of the second round. That's sort of the Michael Penix area where Michael Penix had Cousins ahead of him, still goes at like the mid-second. Jaxson Dart could end up being a 1-2 turn type guy for us. So Dart has some tools there, has some passing ability, and I think he'll get the draft capital. Those are really the only two quarterbacks I want to talk about. Like Dylan Gabriel, guy can play, but he's 5'10". And then a few other quarterbacks we're fine, but not guys that are going to impact our fantasy football teams. But there were plenty of players that are going to be helpful for us in fantasy football at the running back position. And we got to start out with Ollie Gordon. Ollie Gordon is a beast. And this is a player that lost some value this year in dynasty circles. A year ago at this time, Ollie Gordon looked like the potential RB2 in this class behind Ashton Genty. Then this season, big regression. Oklahoma State went from being the Big 12 in the Big 12 title game against Texas to finishing with 3 wins. Ollie Gordon's rushing yardage went way down. Had a massive 2023, slowed down in 2024. Still had 13 rushing scores. Still was a focal point of the offense, but it was not a good offense and not a good season by the standards we had set for Ollie Gordon. So this was a Senior Bowl where Ollie Gordon had to go in and do his thing, and he absolutely did. The beginning of the Senior Bowl, before even the practices get started, we get official weights and official sizes. And Ollie Gordon is just an absolute unit. He's 6'1". He's 233 pounds. The wingspan is huge. Like, he had the biggest wingspan among any of the running backs there. He looks good catching the football for being a larger back. So 233 pounds. And when you stand next to him and then you stand next to some of the tight ends there, Ollie Gordon's like tight end sized, like really big player, like Najee Harris sized running back. I think after what we saw this week with Ollie Gordon, I wouldn't be surprised if he's a second round draft pick. And I wouldn't be surprised if we get to our dynasty rookie drafts And if we like the landing spot, that he's not in the first round of Dynasty rookie drafts. But I think he's a day 2 lock in the NFL draft. And this was a big one for him. Ollie Gordon's also young, just turned 21 years old. So this is a back that has the college production, has the size, and looked noticeably different than all of these other backs. So there's every single back there is going to get drafted. I really believe that. Maybe there'll be a UDFA mixed in, but Ollie Gordon stood out among a bunch of Sunday players as like, okay, I see it. And the footwork was excellent with Ollie Gordon. He's got a lot of balance, but he's also got that size. Somewhere like between maybe the Brian Robinson of Washington as like a floor for what we're going to see out of Gordon. And that's a pretty solid statement. Robinson, 3rd round pick when he was drafted. I think Gordon's going to be a little bit better than him as a pro, to put that in perspective. But if we could go back and redraft, Brian Robinson's had his moments for dynasty managers, for redraft managers. And I think Gordon's got a higher ceiling, certainly, than what we've seen from Robinson. Another back who I was really excited to see at the Senior Bowl was Devin Neal. And I think when I go and finish my rankings at the running back spot, Devin Neal's going to be like running back 8. And some years that would be like running back 8. I don't want that. But running back 8 in this class is a day 2 pick. And I think Devin Neal is going to be a day 2 pick. He's 220 pounds, and that was a huge win. When people talked about Devin Neal in the pre-Senior Bowl process, this is a guy that we thought maybe was going to be like 210. So he weighed in at 220, and he's very solidly built. I spoke to him at the Senior Bowl. There's sort of this fantasy football hive has made these Alvin Kamara comparisons, Tyjae Spears. He told me he models his game after Joe Mixon, but he also watches a lot of Alvin Kamara. And Devin Neal is sensational in the screen game. Kansas didn't do it that often, but when they did, Devin Neal looked really good. And this is a player that is a dynamic runner, had multiple seasons of high productive seasons at Kansas, 3 straight 1,000+ yard rushing years at Kansas. This is a guy who was sort of the offense there. Homegrown guy from Kansas, stayed home, now just has a very solid Senior Bowl. So for me, you're not going to see him on like a lot of all Senior Bowl teams. You're not going to see him like listed as the Senior Bowl winner. But I think for this thing of ours, fantasy football, Devin Neal showed you exactly what you want to see. I think he's a day 2 pick. And if he falls, you're talking about falling into like the 4th round. There's a floor there. If I had to bet on it, he's a 3rd round pick with juice. And if Devin Neal lands correctly, this is a guy who has a chance to push his way into the end of our first rounds in rookie drafts. More likely than not, he's a really good 2nd round pick. But I'm going to have exposure to Devin Neal on my dynasty teams. You should as well. Damien Martinez. This is a back from Miami, just turned 21 like 2 days ago. So he's a 20-year-old back, had a big, successful college career at both Miami and at Oregon State. This is a guy who, when it comes to Damien Martinez, averaged like 6 yards per carry in multiple seasons in college, was the first Miami Hurricane running back to rush for 1,000 yards since like 2016. And Damien Martinez only weighed in at about 225 at the Senior Bowl, but he carries it very well. Martinez did nothing to hurt himself. In my article at Player Profiler about the Senior Bowl, I compared him a little bit to like Trey Benson. And we think about Trey Benson last year, how excited we were to draft him because of the lack of high-end running backs in last year's class. And Trey Benson, of course, had the landing spot to Arizona, which we still like. But with Damien Martinez, I think that's about where we'll see him. Trey Benson was a 3rd round pick. I think that we'll see that from Damien Martinez as well. He's got juice. He's got some explosiveness for a bigger back, and he's a guy that we think can handle volume at the next level. And even though he weighed in a little bit lighter, he certainly looks the part. Nobody was like disappointed by 225 versus 230. But this is a back with power and explosiveness and was a big producer at 2 separate schools. So Damien Martinez, a guy, again, I think he'll be a day 2 selection. One guy who's going to be a day 3 selection, but maybe could sneak into day 2, RJ Harvey. RJ Harvey does everything right. This is a 5'7.5" shorter back, but he weighs like 208 pounds, and he's very, very solid. Like, he's undersized because he's short, but in terms of like his ability to run the football, his ability to catch the football, he's just a very, very well-rounded back. Had a ton of production at Central Florida, 3,500 combined yards over the last 2 years. That's receiving and rushing, and 42 touchdowns over the last 2 seasons. So RJ Harvey is a physical back and a good pass catching back. This is a back that also is telling people that he can run in like the 4.3s. So this is a guy that if he runs a little bit slower than that, that's a huge win. If RJ Harvey can run in the 4.4s with this sort of profile, this is a guy that we're going to be into. Now, the biggest winner at the running back position was Brashard Smith of SMU. And this is a player going in where he had 1 year sample size as a runner. This is a guy where he was a wide receiver at Miami, ends up transferring to SMU, and ends up having this phenomenal season. And he showed it at the Senior Bowl. So he comes in 1,300 rushing yards, 14 rushing scores, and the background as a receiver. And Brashard Smith was unbelievable in the 1v1 pass catching drills. Like, as soon as he started participating in them, he was clearly the best receiving back there, at least in those drills. And he displayed it on the field throughout the week in 11 on 11, 7 on 7s. But what was noticeable about Brashard Smith was he also looked very good as a runner. Broke off a couple of really long runs. He's elusive. He's athletic. If we're looking for this year's Bucky Irving, it could be Brashard Smith. If he lands correctly with his pass catching ability, you're talking about a 200-pound back. So, like, unlike Neal, unlike Gordon, unlike Martinez, he's a 200-pounder. So 200-pound backs, I get it. Like, you know, Jahmyr Gibbs, there's guys like that. But most of the 200-pound backs find themselves in a committee. But if Brashard Smith ends up in a good committee on a good offense, and they give him the pass catching work, and he gets to mix in as a runner, this could be an effective per touch player right away as a rookie. He's a high value touch running back. We also have the fact that he's a converted wide receiver to running back. The last 2 guys we've talked about this time of year getting that hype as a converted wide receiver to running back were Tyrone Tracy and Antonio Gibson. Both of those guys have had success in fantasy football. And I think Brashard Smith is a guy that's going to continue gaining some value. I'll be really excited to see his pro day numbers and also his, of course, NFL Combine numbers. But I am very much into Brashard Smith. A lot of people were, though. This wasn't like some secret. Brashard Smith was one of the biggest winners on day 1 and kept doing it throughout the week. Another running back who displayed excellent quickness, excellent speed. He hit the highest miles per hour of any running back at the Senior Bowl. Had a really strong day 3, really strong day 2, was Bhayshul Tuten of Virginia Tech. And Tuten is a very productive running back. This is a player who transferred to Tech from North Carolina A&T. So he transfers up, goes to the highest possible level, and has this like really big season at VTech. Very, very productive guy. But for me, I think he projects to be a committee back at the NFL level, but one that can help a lot of teams. He's very, very fast. And size-wise, this was another one where people thought maybe Tuten was going to be sub 200 pounds, ends up weighing 211 pounds at 5'8". So he has the speed, he has the necessary weight, and this is a player who definitely helped himself in Mobile. And I could talk about a ton of other running backs here. You know, we're not even talking about like Jarquez Hunter. There's a bunch of guys we could go over, but I do want to, and Marcus Yarns, Delaware, great story there. But we could talk about every player at the Senior Bowl if we start doing it. LeQuint Allen's one that I want to talk about because I'm not seeing a whole lot of buzz after his performance in Mobile, But for what I saw from LeQuint Allen, I think LeQuint Allen's going to end up being a 4th-round pick in the NFL draft. This is a very young player. This is a 20-year-old. Was a very productive player at Syracuse this year. If you watch that Syracuse win over Miami, Allen was awesome in that one. So Allen goes to the NFL draft. There's a lot of people sort of on him in terms of like, it's sort of a disconnect because some of the NFL rankers, guys like Mel Kiper types, the Daniel Jeremiahs, the guys who are looking at actual NFL draft and not necessarily from a fantasy perspective, they've talked a little bit about LeQuint Allen. And LeQuint Allen has very good pass catching ability. He weighed in at 207 pounds. This was another guy where we thought he'd be like 195. Ends up weighing in at 207 pounds. So I think that was a very, very big win for him. But really, I think for Allen, is going to end up being a pass catching specialist back for someone. But anyway, you cut it, solid week for him, even though it's a little bit under the radar if you're looking at Senior Bowl winner type lists. But I think we saw just enough there from him where he's not going to like catapult himself into round 2 or something crazy. But I do think he'll end up being like a 4th or 5th round pick and one with some things he does well that could translate for us in fantasy football. Now, the wide receiver position, it's been a continual thing where if you go to Mobile and you shine at the wide receiver spot, you end up being a productive pro. And I don't think that's going to change. And people are going to talk about like Elick Ayamaner from Stanford, which was my favorite wide receiver going into this, didn't participate. So somebody told him, hey, Elick, you're a top 40 pick. You don't need to go to Mobile. Pull out. And that also happened with Cam Scatabo at the running back position. But Elick Ayamaner, I think this would be the guy that would have done it and would have had a fantastic Senior Bowl, but we don't know because he didn't show up. But that's still a player where I think he's going to get drafted very highly in the NFL draft. I've said that on the record. I think he's like a top 50 pick, and I think he's one that we are really going to like. So there was a lot of guys at the Senior Bowl that we were excited to get a chance to see live and excited to get a chance to separate themselves. And the one player that I think gained the most value at the wide receiver spot, Jaylen Noel. Jaylen Noel was terrific. And Jaylen Noel was one where I'm sitting with Brett Whitefield of Fantasy Points and Cody Carpentier of Roster Watch. And I'm like, Jaylen Noel, before practice even started on day 1, I'm like, Jaylen Noel is like the vibes guy. Guys just go out there and you're like, okay, this guy is going to do it. Looked good in like the pre-practice warm-ups. And I'm like, okay, this is Jaylen Noel time. And Jaylen Noel ends up being better than I could have anticipated. He's a little bit under 5'10", and he's a little bit under 200 pounds, but he's a strong player. And this is one where the productivity was absolutely there at Iowa State, was also a big play artist where he had a number of big plays over 50 yards. But Jaylen Noel, this is a guy where I think a number of teams are going to look at him and they're going to say he's a plug-and-play slot receiver and one who can also move around. He made a bunch of big-time catches downfield and also was just unguardable in the 1v1s. Like, Jaylen Noel was a day 1 winner and then just continued to do it throughout the week. Like, I think Jaylen Noel, and I've seen a couple of these post-Senior Bowl mock drafts, and they haven't really risen Jaylen Noel up to where I think he'll end up. Jaylen Noel is still getting mocked to be like a 3rd-round pick in superflex drafts. I think he's going to be a 2nd-round pick in superflex drafts because I think that the draft capital is going to be higher than what people think. He had 80 catches this year. He had nearly 1,200 receiving yards, a bunch of big plays, and he was in the slot like 70% of the time for Iowa State. This is a guy, though, that has versatility. I mean, I was sitting with some people that said poor man's Amon-Ra St. Brown. And that's not saying that he's going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. Probably more of like a career trajectory, maybe Christian Kirk, peak Christian Kirk. But Christian Kirk gave us a wide receiver 1 season, gave us multiple wide receiver 2 type production seasons. Jaylen Noel, I think, is going to get that round 2 draft capital. I'm going to be higher on Jaylen Noel than most. Now, another wide receiver who sort of solidified things, and it's crazy because he's 156 pounds, but Tez Johnson is nasty. Tez Johnson moved differently than everyone else on the field. I put Jaylin Noel as the first person to talk about because I think that he had a little bit more of a rise here. But Tez Johnson solidified everything that we wanted to see. This is a player who set the Oregon record for the most receptions in a season with like 86 catching balls from Bo Nix in 2023. Then this year, Tez Johnson backed it up with another really, really big season. This is a guy who put like 170 yards on Penn State. Like Tez Johnson had tremendous production at Oregon, goes to the Senior Bowl, and it's funny, there were people completely writing him off after the weigh-in, where it's like, I'm off Tez Johnson because this is a guy who only weighed 156 pounds. But it's today's NFL. We look at guys like Tutu Atwell, was drafted in the second round. We looked at Tank Dell, drafted in the third round. Devonta Smith obviously was a level above those guys, but Devonta Smith was drafted easily inside the top 10, top 12 picks in the NFL draft. The Jordan Addison drafted very, very highly, like 170 pounds. Like the low BMI wide receivers in today's NFL, it doesn't matter as much. And the people saying he's off my list because of it are not playing this game right. You're actually going to get a discount with Tez Johnson. Tez Johnson's the kind of guy that I could see ripping off like a big play in the preseason, and dynasty managers were like, why didn't I draft Tez Johnson? This is a guy who's going to have a role. Transferred up from Troy State to go to Oregon, and just his production just went way, way, way up. This is a player that, again, moves differently. He's so nasty when it comes to all the one-on-one drills. It was almost like literally unguardable. They'd have a couple of like coach picked one-on-ones to end practice where both sides sort of like circle up and it's best man versus best man. And you saw Tez Johnson just dominate in those ones. Didn't matter which defensive back was on him. He was able to separate and make plays, and some of them just looked silly. So Tez Johnson, this is a guy that despite being 156 pounds, I think he's going to end up being a third-round pick in the NFL draft. And if he falls, he'll be a fourth-round pick. But he's really, really good, and a guy that we're going to be rooting for here at Player Profiler. Jack Bech, another player who gained a ton of value. So Jack Bech is a guy who started out at LSU. He's about 6'1", 6'2", weighed in well. He was 215 pounds. He's very solidly built. And Jack Bech caught everything. He had probably the best catch in the entire Senior Bowl on a deep sideline grab from a pass from Jalen Milroe, where Bech like contorted and made this crazy catch. Jack Bech was really, really good. This is a guy where coming in, I thought maybe this would be a slot receiver, but I think that he's got more juice there where he can bounce on the outside and play inside. Jack Bech, I think, is like way under the radar still, despite what he did in Mobile, and people don't want to kind of believe it, but he's a very, very good player. This is also a player who had production this year at TCU, played with Savion Williams, who obviously moved around a lot, but this is a guy where Jack Bech had over 1,000 receiving yards, had 9 touchdown catches. I'm into Jack Bech. I think that he's a very good player. I'll be interested to see where the draft capital is, but I think he did a lot, and I think it's still a little bit under the radar right now. One player who's certainly not under the radar is Jayden Higgins. Now, Jayden Higgins is a player that I had more hype about than Jaylen Noel going into this one. And Jayden Higgins still can get drafted ahead of Jaylen Noel. Jayden Higgins has tremendous size. He doesn't look bulky when he's out there. He's got like a big lower body. The upper body, you wouldn't think he was quite as heavy as he weighed in, but he weighed in at 217 pounds. He's almost 6'4". He's 6'3.5". He's got a very large wingspan, and his production was awesome at Iowa State. This is a player that was top 10 in the nation in both catches and in receiving yardage. Jaylen Noel as well. Both of those guys had 80 or more catches this year. So they were sort of like an unbelievable combination. You're not used to seeing Iowa State have 2 wide receivers that are going to get drafted. I think both these guys are going to be second-round picks when it's all comes down to it. Jayden Higgins has athleticism. He's very agile. He's showed the ability that he can play the slot where they can bump him inside as like a big slot receiver. Jayden Higgins was one of the best players on the field in multiple days at the wide receiver spot. So when you combine that production with what he was able to do in Mobile and also his ability on contested catches, I think Jayden Higgins has done enough to get very solid NFL draft capital. Talking about Xavier Restrepo, this was one where disappointment, a little bit. You can still see it, where Xavier Restrepo is still a really good route runner, but he's 5'9", not 5'10". This is a guy who had some unbelievable production. He's the only Miami wide receiver ever to have back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons, but it just wasn't playing as well as Jaylin Noel or Tez Johnson. So you're talking about like of the 5'9" type wide receiver, like he's just wasn't doing it. He had some very good moments, but day one was sort of noticeable where he was behind Jaylin Noel. And I think heading into this, Restrepo was ranked ahead of Jaylin Noel by everybody. So I would not have Restrepo ahead of Higgins. I would not have him ahead of Noel. He's definitely not going to be ahead of Tez Johnson for me. I'm probably going to have Jack Bech ahead of him as well. So Xavier Restrepo is a guy that I still think has tremendous toughness. And I think he can rebound for us as a dynasty prospect if he lands on a team that's going to park him right in the slot. Because I think that's what he is at the next level. I think he's a slot wide receiver. And if you watched Miami this year, he looked like he was going to be way more than that. Where you think about like the Florida game, where he's running away from secondaries, making plays on the outside. He's definitely has the toughness. He definitely has the college production. But I think he's more of a slot receiver than maybe we thought going in. Now, one other player who was a huge producer in college and had some very strong moments at the Senior Bowl was Tai Felton. Tai Felton made a number of really, really good catches. This is a fun player. And it was one where he was one of the most targeted players in college football. I think he was third in college football in targets, second at the wide receiver position. He had 96 catches this year for Maryland, over 1,100 receiving yards, and you could see why. Made a couple of really nice downfield catches. This is a guy with Tai Felton. I'm not sure what the draft capital will be. I think Felton is a guy that NFL teams will want to see his testing numbers at the combine, but he certainly helped himself this week in Mobile. Another player who helped himself out was Kyle Williams. And Kyle Williams for Washington State may have done just enough to sneak inside the third round of the NFL draft. He's 5'10", 182. He isn't the biggest receiver, but he's very quick. He has downfield speed. He had the fastest miles per hour reading of any wide receiver on day one. And then he backed it up with strong performances on day 2 and day 3. So over a 3-day period, impressive catches. And then when you look at the production at Washington State, combined with the Senior Bowl showing, he had almost 1,200 receiving yards, 14 touchdown catches this year. This is a guy who played with Cam Ward last year and then obviously had to adjust this year. Kyle Williams is a guy that definitely did some good things for himself. Now, besides Iamaner, the number one wide receiver that I talked about going in was Jalen Royals. Jalen Royals was a guy that I probably had highest in my wide receiver rankings going in. I spoke to Jalen Royals. He told me that he was only at about 80%. If you recall, this year, had those massive games against Boise State and UNLV, had like a 200-yard performance against Boise State, obviously a very strong Boise State team. And Royals ends up going down for the season with foot injury. So he's back here in Mobile. So the downfield speed, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But Jalen Royals is nasty underneath. This is a guy where he's just a killer on underneath routes and manhandled defensive backs who tried to press him. He's like a really strong wide receiver. And this is a guy who had 15 touchdown grabs his junior year in 2023 at Utah State. And this year was averaging like 120 yards per game before he went down. So he has the big-time production, well-built player, really good route runner. Jalen Royals didn't hurt himself, but he's definitely not going to be in like the if you had to pick the all Senior Bowl team, you're talking about guys like Bech. You're talking about guys like the 2 Iowa State wide receivers if you had to pick one. And then that sort of wraps up the wide receiver position. Now, running back is a strength, but the one of the best positions in this NFL draft, period, and certainly on the offensive side of the ball, is tight end. This is a transformative year at the tight end position, and no player helped himself more in Mobile than Elijah Arroyo of Miami. Elijah Arroyo was just awesome at the Senior Bowl. This is a guy where if I had to bet on it, he's a top 45 pick in the NFL draft. And there is a chance Elijah Arroyo could have that Dalton Kincaid-like ascension and go into the end of the first round. Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland, top 2 tight ends in this class. Arroyo's right there as my tight end 3 now. And there's a chance he could have an unbelievable combine. When you watch him out on the field, this is a guy who's going to have great athletic measurables at the combine. He's 6'4.5". He's 251 pounds. He's 21 years old. Completely dominated every single drill. Fried defensive backs. Fried in the one-on-one drills. Made a bunch of catches in the 11-on-11s. This is a guy where I think he's going to end up becoming the chalk tight end 3 if he's not already. I love Elijah Arroyo. If you're in a tight end premium league, this is exactly the kind of player you want. I mentioned his size, the 6'4.5", 251 pounds. This is comparable size that we've seen from guys like Sam Laporta. This is kind of what we've seen from guys like Trey McBride, a little bit bigger than a Brock Bowers, but that's sort of like overgrown wide receiver frame. That's what we're getting out of Elijah Arroyo. He's probably the single biggest winner in this entire Senior Bowl on the offensive side of the ball. Just played about as good as it gets. Another tight end who was really impressive, Mason Taylor. And Mason Taylor's dad is Jason Taylor. So not to like age myself, but if you're my age, you know Jason Taylor was that guy on the Miami Dolphins. Jason Taylor was one of the most athletic defensive ends in football and had a very, very strong career. His son, Mason Taylor, is going to be a longtime starting tight end at the NFL level. He is a beast. This is a guy who's an absolute unit of a player, like 6'4", 250. Physically, he's ready to hold up as a blocker, and he could be an every down tight end right away. He stood out as a red zone receiver, and there's never tight end production at LSU. Like these guys at LSU at the tight end position, they don't produce because they're always playing next to NFL wide receivers, and they emphasize the wide receiver position. I think Mason Taylor on several other college programs would have way better statistics. So this is a player that definitely helped himself out. He's a younger tight end. He's like 20 years old. Like Arroyo, I think Mason Taylor is almost a lock to be selected in the second round of the NFL draft. I think both of those guys are going to get that great draft capital. And we've got to talk about my guy, Harold Fannin Jr. So heading into this, not only did I have Harold Fannin Jr. as my tight end 3 in the class, but I had Harold Fannin Jr. as like a guy that I'm going to push up in my rankings, where impactful tight end. Now, nothing really changed with Harold Fannin Jr. He showed the ability to catch the football, made some insane catches. This is a guy who is a natural pass catcher. The stats back it up. Harold Fannin Jr. had the most receptions in college football this year, the most receiving yards of any player this year in college football, and actually set the NCAA record for the most receptions in a season by a tight end ever and the most receiving yards. And he did against big schools too. Smoked Penn State. He smoked Texas A&M. Only 2 big schools they played against. So Harold Fannin Jr. had the elite production, but for me, Arroyo's got to go ahead of him. Fannin Jr. is still a guy that I'm going to be on, but he didn't wow this week. It wasn't like Fannin Jr. went down there and was head and shoulders above every other tight end. On the flip side, Arroyo moves ahead of Fannin Jr. for me. I'm still going to have Fannin Jr. ranked very highly among all tight ends. I think he's going to be tight end 4 or tight end 5. And in this class, that's fine. Harold Fannin Jr. is a really good pass catcher, but I do think the landing spot and the draft capital are going to matter a little bit more than they would have if he would have had just this insane Senior Bowl. So very good Senior Bowl for Harold Fannin Jr., but not like an A+ like Arroyo. So we also, Gunnar Helm was not there. He's the Texas tight end. He's going to be in contention. So this was definitely great going over all these guys. Highly recommend some of my rookie mock drafts, some of my rookie rankings I've been dropping over here at Player Profiler Podcast and over at Player Profiler YouTube. We're going to be dropping these videos all year long, getting you ready for all of your Dynasty teams. But specifically, the next 2+ months, we're going to be all about this rookie class. We're going to cover some other Dynasty topics, some other redraft topics, but we are going to get you ready to dominate your Dynasty rookie drafts, going to get you ready to dominate your early redraft leagues with what rookies you should target, and we're going to get you ready to win a ton in fantasy football in 2025. We'll see you soon.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.